Hello, everyone. I'd like to start. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center. It's our great pleasure to welcome our distinguished visitor today. Geneviève Zubrzycki is the William Sewell Collegiate Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan, where she also serves as the director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. No, sorry. No. Okay, never mind. Her empire is expansive, but not that expansive. And also as the director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies.
Yes.
She is a scholar of nationalism, national myths, and religion. And her work has been very influential in this field and amply rewarded with numerous awards. She's the author of 3 prize-winning books: The Crosses of Auschwitz, Nationalism and Religion in Poland, Beheading the Saint, Nationalism, Religion, and Secularism in Quebec, and most recently, Resurrecting the Jew, Nationalism, Philosemitism, and Poland's Jewish Revival. And so today she'll be presenting this most recent work. We're very much looking forward to her talk. We will have a hard stop at 1, but nonetheless, please join me in welcoming Geneviève today.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction and for the invitation to present the book, and everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to see a nice crowd to hear about what's going on in Poland today, but also more broadly to try to understand the Jewish revival in Poland and what is the Jewish revival, because it's actually kind of a misnomer or not quite the right term to describe what's going on with Polish-Jewish relations in Poland. But before I go into the talk, I just wanted to situate that work, because actually this book is a companion to The Crosses of Auschwitz, in which I was analyzing the reconfiguration of the relationship between national identity, Polishness, and Catholicism after the fall of communism. And my question when I started my dissertation at the University of Chicago was whether there would be a secularization of society, a decline in the influence of the Catholic Church in Poland with the fall of communism. And it was not happening. And instead, what you started seeing is really struggles between people who wanted to build a more secular society in which the church would be less influential, and also that wanted to divorce Polish national identity from Catholicism. And there was a strong backlash against that movement already in the 1990s. And a lot of it also took place around historical sites of the Holocaust. Hence my focus on Auschwitz, where ultranationalists and self-defined post-Catholics started erecting hundreds of crosses there. So I was interested in the use of Christian symbols in the public sphere to really kind of ossify or really ground a specific vision of Polishness that was slowly eroding with the fall of communism. And yet there was no massive secularization or massive withdrawal from the Catholic Church. My second book then was focusing on an entirely different society, on Quebec, where there had been in the 1960s a very rapid secularization of society called the Quiet Revolution, and where French-Canadian identity was transformed within 10 years into a secular Quebecois national identity, and where secularism became enshrined, actually sacralized as a key value of a modern Quebec identity. And while I was writing that book, I started, continued going to Poland, and then was witnessing really the beginning of a mainstream revival of Jewish culture in Poland. So I was writing the book on Quebec, but starting the research for the third book. And so these 3 books are really in conversation, some around empirical problems related to Poland, but also theoretically about trying to tease out really the relationship between religion, nationalism, and secularism. So to give you a little bit of context about the questions I ask in my scholarship. Now, Poland. So what Poland is and should be has been at the center of public debates and political fights since the fall of state socialism in that country. And Polish society has become even more divided with the rise of far-right populism in the past 10, 15 years. One faction favors a traditional vision of Polish identity crystallized around Catholicism, conservative family values, and a national narrative that emphasizes Polish martyrdom and heroism. Another faction promotes progressive values and secularism and questions key tenets of Polish national mythology. And in that contest over Poland and Polishness, history and memory occupy center stage. And in the past 2 decades, Poles have engaged in a very divisive debate about their participation in violent crimes against Jews before, during, and after the Second World War. And that difficult process of soul searching and reckoning with the past is described by the right as anti-Polish, which the far-right populist law and justice government, which was in power from 2015 until just this last fall, attempted to short-circuit using every weapon in its arsenal. So you've probably heard about the Holocaust speech law and reforms in education. So various forms of censorship of research and the teaching of the Holocaust on the one hand, and then really a very counteroffensive and resacralization of Polishness with an emphasis on the rightists, for example, and on Polish suffering during World War II. At the same time, however, Poland's small Jewish community has undergone a significant renewal and a significant, substantial number of institutions, non-Jewish public figures, memory activists, and ordinary citizens are engaged in a multifaceted resurrection of Jewish culture. So these are the twin phenomena commonly blended into the single name, Poland's Jewish revival. But they are distinct, they're parallel, and they intersect in interesting ways. I'll be discussing that. So to give you an idea of the scope of what we call the Jewish revival, there are about 40 festivals of Jewish culture in Poland today. Festivals that actually are spread throughout the country. And you can see that the first one started in 1988 in Kraków. Then you start having other ones in Wrocław, Tarnów, Włodawa. But really the mid-2000s, after Poland joins the EU, is when you start having more of them. And then by the 2010s, they're throughout Poland. And so what that map shows is really the spread, the geographical spread, and also that this is not, these kinds of festivals of Jewish, celebration of Jewish culture is not just the concern of, cosmopolitan urban people. You have also these types of celebrations in small Polish towns and villages. The interest in all things Jewish, however, happens throughout the year. So you have lots of Jewish-style restaurants, Jewish, klezmer clubs, bookshops that have been opening mostly also again in the year 2000s, after 2000. And then there's a wide array of types of, so this kind of nostalgic faux Jewish stuff in Kazimierz, but also Tel Aviv urban food, so then Israeli versions of Jewish culture, and then more classical. And what's interesting about that one, about klezmer hoys, is you have mixes of food, so you have chulent, but you note the spelling of this. I mean, this is meant not for tourists, but for a Polish-speaking, actually, clientele who pay quite a bit of money to often eat foods that are very similar, if not the same, as Polish, Polish potato pancakes are the same in Jewish or non-Jewish restaurants. Several new museums, memorials, and memory spaces were created. Probably the most important is the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, but you have the Galician Museum in Krakow, Schindler's Factory Museum, the Ghetto Eagles Pharmacy, and a lot of memory spaces that are meant to commemorate and to signal the past presence of Jews throughout Poland. Lots of commemorative practices also. This one celebrating or commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And now that symbol of that daffodil that opens into a yellow star is not only in Warsaw, but throughout Poland. And it's tens of thousands. I think now that they produce about 150,000 of those flowers that people wear throughout the spring because they keep them on their their coats. So one other important development for which I don't have visuals is the academic interest in Jewish studies. So over the past 2 decades, several Jewish and Holocaust studies programs were founded at many universities. Yiddish and Hebrew language courses are offered at academic institutions, but also through private organizations and through private tutors that offer their services. And between 2011 and 2021, about 100 academic books and several hundred articles on Jewish topics were published on average every year. Every year. Many written to be accessible to a broader public, which explains also why you also have Judaica bookshops that have, mushroom open in different cities, or that pretty much every regular, that means not nationalist bookstores or Catholic bookstores, have a Judaica section now. Because there are so many publications. A last indicator of the Jewish revival, for which there are no official statistics, but that were reported to me by rabbis and community leaders, is the modest but steady number of conversions to Judaism. Most of those conversions are by people who find out that they have a grandparent or great-grandparent sometimes, and then they feel compelled to return to the source. But there are others who convert that have no Jewish origins, and they are called by the appeal of Judaism. And rabbis in different cities of Poland offer the necessary training to undergo the conversion process. So what we call the Jewish revival is really a multifaceted phenomenon that can be observed in a variety of social spaces in Poland. While Philosemitism and Jewish revivals exist in other European societies, the intensity of that revival and its territorial spread in Poland is really remarkable. And it is sociologically puzzling precisely because it is enacted primarily and almost entirely by non-Jews. So if you want to think comparatively, in post-war Germany, the carving out of Jewish spaces in the public sphere was initially performed by converts to Judaism, by members of Jewish German associations, and later by Israeli organizations, as well as by a cadre of academics. But then you had the arrival of some 80,000 Soviet Jews with the collapse of the Soviet Union that injected new energy into German Jewish life. And then in the last 10, 15 years, there's also Israeli migration to Germany, primarily to Berlin, that is also injecting some kind of revival into communal life. In Hungary, another case, that process has been led primarily by Hungarian Jews and is facilitated by the relatively high number in that country. So there's about between 75,000 and 100,000. And they are primarily concentrated in Budapest that has plenty of material cultural sites, Jewish sites, including 16 active synagogues in Budapest alone. So In contrast, there's very little that remains from Poland's once large, vibrant, and diverse Jewish communities. The number of Jews living in Poland today is estimated to be between 5,000 and 40,000. The wide variation depending on how you define Jewishness. So 5,000, it's people who self-declare themselves as Jewish or partly Jewish in the census, and 40,000 is estimates by Jewish leaders. However, when I asked the chief rabbi of Poland how many Jews there were in Poland, he would say, well, how many do you think there are? Because, multiply by 2 and add 1, because there's always one coming out of the closet. And the closet metaphor is an important one within the Jewish communities. People are actually using the closet metaphor. And then the question is what makes it possible for people to want to come out of the closet when 30 years ago it was not something that they would do? And one reason is also the interest of non-Jews in all things Jewish that provides this kind of broader social environment and cultural resources for people who are discovering some kind of Jewish ancestry and are interested in reappropriating it in a way that's not intimidating, right? It's difficult to go knock on a rabbi's door. Going to the Jewish festival in Krakow is easier. Going to the JCC in Krakow is also easier. And that's actually this is where the intersection of what non-Jewish Poles are doing is supporting the revival or the renewal of Jewish communal life. Mm-hmm. And of course, that phenomenon must be situated in a specific historical context. So the fall of communism was very important because Jewishness and the Holocaust were taboo topics under communism. So after the fall of state socialism, people are less afraid to discuss these things. And then those who knew they had Jewish ancestries can talk about them. And those who did not know and learn find out by chance very often, can actually explore those identities. The opening of the Eastern Bloc also made institutional support and funding for the renewal of Jewish communal life available, and it facilitated also the development of Holocaust tourism, which in turn participated in an ongoing gentrification of formerly neglected Jewish neighborhoods and sites. That's especially the case in Kraków and Kazimierz. Also, the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of Soviet archives was very important because then you had new numbers, new data actually on especially what happened at Auschwitz, and a revision of narrative that was very important, especially after 1992. And then Poles were confronted with the explicit knowledge that they had not been the main victims of World War II, that Jews were, and that created a lot of, what I call in my first book, a narrative shock. They were surprised and they really pushed back against that. It is, however, in 2000, with the publication of Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, that tells the story of a program in northeastern Poland in which ethnic Poles tortured, and murdered their Jewish neighbors, that Poles experienced another shockwave, discovering their own role in the Holocaust, which led to what is perhaps the most significant transformation in the historical consciousness in the past several decades. And that initiated a process of national demystification on the one hand and denial on the other. And really 2000 is really marking, you could say there's Poland before Neighbors by Jan Gross and after. And then of course in 2004, Poland joins the EU, which opened up access to significant resource for cultural and civic programs. But that specific, so that's a specific context in which the Jewish revival is taking place, which explains some of the timing and the scope. And we might be tempted to see that revival as simply a move to counter right-wing populism or to be one form of anti-Semitism. But that interpretation is empirically wrong, since the beginnings of the Jewish revival precede Poland's sharp turn to the right in the mid-2010s. So late 1980s for the revival of Jewish communal life, and early 2000 for Polish cultural enthusiasm for all things Jewish. And that interpretation is also sidestepping the internal logic of both anti and philo-Semitism. So to make sense of the Jewish turn, the book considers macro, meso, and micro dimensions. And in this talk, I'll focus primarily on non-Jews' efforts at resurrecting Jewish culture. Although I'll be happy to talk about the renewal of Jewish communal life in the Q&A. So analyzing Jewish-centered initiatives sponsored by state institutions, NGOs, analyzing civic projects and everyday practices of ordinary citizens provided me with a view of the production of the Jewish cultural revival, as well as its consumption and recreation by participants. I show in the book that Polish philo-Semitism is a dynamic, unfolding movement that in its most introspective form challenges the narrow ethnocultural association of Polishness and Catholicism. It strives to articulate a civic and secular definition of a national identity and to build a modern polity. So then the question is, why is that project operated primarily through Jews? Why Jews? Why is there such fascination with Jews? So there are several reasons I will show during the talk, but let's begin with two. First, because Jewishness is an ethno-religious category that has traditionally been perceived by Poles as the polar opposite of the hyphenated Polak Catholic category. Second, because Western-style capitalism, socialism, and cosmopolitanism are specifically associated with Jewishness. So as Jewishness is standing for capitalism, socialism, and cosmopolitanism, Poland is said by the right to be ruled by Jews, by symbolic Jews, who must be neutralized. Hence the anti-Semitism in a country with very few Jews. Former dissident Adam Michnik calls that form of anti-Semitism magical anti-Semitism. Michnik says normal anti-Semitism goes this way. Adam Michnik is a Jew, therefore he's probably a thief, a liar, or whatnot. Magical anti-Semitism works the other way around. Adam Michnik, let's say, is a thief, a liar, or whatnot. Therefore, he's most likely a Jew. And I'm going to show an example of that type of discourse that happens all the time in the press. Here's a visual example where you have Adam Michnik, who's secular, but now he's portrayed with a kippah as an observant Jew. Tusk also. And what's interesting in this, Kwasniewski is that there are people here that are actually on the right. So it's not just liberal. So any opponent is transformed into Jews. So the category of Jewishness, and the caption here of a very virtual Poland, that means not Polish, or the use of the adjectives Polish speaking instead of Polish is a form of anti-Semitism to flag, or when people refer to so-called Kwasniewski, to imply that actually that's not his real name, that he's got some kind of Jewish name that was changed down the road. Even John Paul II is accused by the far right sometimes to be a Jew. So here a mural to the Pope, the Polish Pope, was defaced with anti-Semitic graffiti. So this goes really far, this kind of magical anti-Semitism. But the same logic applies to Philosemitism. So as Jews represent modernity, different facets of modernity, the revival of the Jewish community should be supported and Jewish culture promoted for those who want a liberal Poland. So liberal youth wear T-shirts and brandish posters in protest against Catholic nationalists, subversively and humorously claiming that they are Jews. A 40-year-old lawyer living in Warsaw, for example, exclaimed that wearing a certain brand of clothing, a Jewish line, you had me at Shalom, for example, that's interesting too, that is a person of color wearing it, right? So again, being Jewish is being colorful and diverse, racially diverse. So he's saying wearing, it's called Risk Oi, that brand, Polish brand from Warsaw, is like taking part in a public discussion about Jews in Poland, that Jews live here and that Jews can live here. And that's an important comment because it highlights that public discussion about Jews in Poland is about the very identity of Poland. It is a critique of the still dominant vision of the nation as ethnically Polish and at least nominally Catholic. And, you know, Poland is about, now numbers are changing, but it's like 92, 93% ethnically Polish and about the same 90% nominally Catholic. So it's a very homogeneous society on that front. So my interviews with key cultural entrepreneurs and numerous non-Jewish activists show that their promotion of Jewish culture is part of their attempt to counter the monopoly of the Catholic right over the definition of Polishness and to expand what it means to be Polish. So Janusz Maku, who's the co-founder and the director of Krakow's Festival of Jewish Culture, which is the largest the largest festival of Jewish culture in the world, told me in one of our conversations, Krakow was always a multicultural place where cultural pluralism was often very obvious. However, this national monotheism, religious monotheism that was created after the Second World War is scorching me, it's hurting me. I really don't like this. So let's go back to what is the basis of our spirituality, actually, since Jews were Polish citizens. This comment is significant as it shows how one of the key actors in the resurrection of Jewish culture in Poland grounds that cultural enterprise in a political project, that of expanding notions of Polishness, but more importantly and radically, that of shifting the very idiom of nationhood toward a civic definition, that is a community of citizens rather than an ethnic community. And consider what Anya, a non-Jewish 30-something art historian who dances in a Jewish dance group that actually even travels throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and none of the members of that dance group are Jewish. So she says, on the one hand, Jewish culture is, let's say, Oriental. But on the other hand, because it developed in Poland, in spite of everything, it's somehow very much tied with Poland, yes? It's kind of an exotic element in an environment. It's not something like Swahili somewhere far in Africa, but rather something that is different from Polish culture, yet at the same time related to it, inseparable from it even. So a third reason why expansions of national identity are articulated around Jews and Jewish culture more specifically is that Jews, unlike Ukrainians, who are too similar to Poles, and unlike also the Vietnamese, which constitute the largest visible minority in Poland and who are concentrated in Warsaw and are too different, Jews are both exotic and somewhat indigenous in the discourse of these activists. They are different enough, yet were, quote, nourished from the Polish soil and grew on these lands, unquote, as another interviewee told me. Jewishness is thus both other and ours, comments that were made spontaneously by countless interviewees. In that sense, then they become the perfect indigenous other. This indigenization of a multicultural Poland is important because civic discourses can be perceived as a remnant of Communist Party state rhetoric and or as an export from the EU and neoliberal Polish elites. So progressive civic nationalists have to work twice as hard to make their vision of the nation legitimate and authentically Polish. Public intellectuals have tried to promote a civic vision by reconstructing a narrative that emphasizes the political heritage of the nation in Poland by looking back to 16th century religious tolerance, the First Republic's multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state, to Poland's elective monarchy and the 1791 constitution, to interwar liberal traditions, and to a certain extent to Solidarity's peaceful resistance and civic activism in the 1980s, but with limited success because the right and the far right also uses some of these historical themes in their symbols. So because the right uses some of these themes, the Jewish trope becomes especially relevant. The large number of Jews who settle in Poland thus becomes key for a Polish civic narrative. As I heard many times in various venues, when Jews were being kicked out from Southern and Western Europe, King Kazimierz the Great was welcoming them in Poland. So embracing elements of Jewish culture becomes a way to plausibly demonstrate that Poles were actually European avant la lettre, since Poland welcomed Jewish refugees centuries ago. So Poland's Jewish past provides plenty of cultural material to articulate an alternative national discourse, which is presented as Poland's true essence, its authentic multicultural self. Ula explained to me that she wanted to learn about Jews and Jewish culture to better know herself as a Pole. So she says, well, basically, there's been a Jewish presence in our country, u nas, for 800 years on our lands here in Poland. So there's this influence that we don't remember anymore because there are almost no Jews left in Poland. But it's important to know that culture so that we can better know ourselves, our identity, who we are. And that brings us to something important that she says here. Precisely because there are few Jews in Poland, it's easier to project onto them fantasies of the past or the future. So paradoxically then, ethnicity and religion remain the categories through which civic nationalists attempt to transcend ethno-religious nationalism. And that conundrum is at the basis of what I call the tragedy of Polish civic nationalism. To escape ethno-religious nationalism, they must resort to its very categories, ethnicity and religion. And part of that tragedy is that in order to achieve the goals of civic nationalism and multiculturalism, the Jew must remain other. And Jewish culture becomes a means through which Poles reinvent themselves. Let's go back to Makuch again. Whether people know it or not, it is a fact that Jews for many, many centuries made tremendous contributions to Polish cultures. So when we're talking about Polish culture, we're equally talking about Jewish culture. Without the contribution of Jews, true Polish culture couldn't exist. Forget it. What I'm trying to do is to help Poles realize what is theirs. And Makuch's comment, what I'm trying to do is to help Poles realize what is theirs, is certainly perplexing. But it was clear to me that cultural appropriation was not the right lens to make sense of Polish Philosemitism, not only because cultural appropriation lumps together a wide array of practices with different meanings, but also because it's a normative term rather than a concept or heuristic device. And we need to find finer instruments. And in the book, I developed a typology of what I call registers of engagement with the culture of the other that allows to analyze these various practices. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. So to conclude, okay. What does the case of Poland's Jewish turn teach us? So my work shows that the ways and the extent to which dominant modes of imagining the nation shape not only formal membership rules such as citizenship, so thinking of Rogers Brubaker's work in 1992, but it also shapes symbolic membership to the national community. that the nation is generally imagined in ethnic terms in Poland, as is elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, explains why some non-ethnically Polish residents and citizens may never fully belong. It also explains why some members of the dominant ethno-national group are symbolically excluded from the national community for their political leanings, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, or gender identity by being ethnicized, by being turned into Jews. And you can see that actually a lot of LGBTQ activists are often being accused of being Jews. This is helpful to understand other cases. So consider France, for example, the paradigmatic case of civic nationhood, where inclusion into the national community is premised upon one's adherence to the social contract, not blood. So how can the French right symbolically exclude ethnic and racial minorities from the French nation? They do so by ideologizing them, by turning Arabs, for example, into dangerous Muslims that threaten the Republic by infringing upon secularism, a sacred tenet of the social contract. So in civic nations, you have the opposite. Just like Obama, for example, was not being accused, it's not based on race, but it was based on the fact rumors that he was not born in the US and that you can be un-American, but un-Americans often are actually racial minorities. The book also highlights that regardless of how progressive a national project may be, there remains a problematic tension in expanding the symbolic boundaries of the nation through the other, as that other, whether real or symbolic, remains malleable in the hands of those who control the category. The symbolic power exerted to articulate the principles of vision and division for a particular group, to quote Pierre Bourdieu, is therefore still violent even when it's used to expand the symbolic boundaries of the group. Considering the motivations of individuals engaging with the culture of other groups and the personal meaning their practices have for them, however, remains essential if we are to gain any understanding of phenomena like Philosemitism and performative solidarity. But this is not to say, of course, that part of the Jewish revival is not about other properly Jewish processes, for it obviously is. And I analyze the renewal of Jewish communal life proper in the book as well. What I argued here today is that one must nonetheless see a relationship between non-Jewish Poles' support of and participation in the Jewish revival and the desire to build a Poland that is different from the one forcefully promoted by the Catholic Church and the right. And that is the dominant way of understanding and feeling the nation in that country. This is not to say that the hegemonic place of Catholicism in Poland is only or even primarily contested and countered via the support of Judaism and Jewish culture. It is also operated via critiques of the church and of traditional forms of Polish Catholicism, via formal demands for stricter separation of church and state, via apostasy movements, and via the support of the rights of various alternative groups, primarily sexual minorities and feminists, who significantly also support the Jewish revival as they understand their minority status and their struggle as one shared by Jews. In the end, my research reiterates the case for interpretive sociology, that it is only by paying attention to the multiple varied motivations and meanings of cultural phenomena that we can appreciate their full significance. And without such an approach to Poland's Jewish revival, we might remain stuck in bewildered incomprehension or limited to its normative valuation. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was going fast. I was doing my best so that we have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. So we'll open up to the Q&A. Norman, start off with you.
So I have a lot of questions, but maybe I'll just try to keep them brief if I can. The first one really is, how deep do you think the Philosemitism goes, and how deep is this phenomenon in Polish society, so that we can count on it not disappearing again in 10 years or doing a flip flop as it does sometimes. So that's the first question. Second question is a little more difficult to formulate, but I think it really has to do with the question of Holocaust consciousness of sorts. We were in Italy, as I mentioned, this fall, and it's clear that the Italians have gotten really interested in questions of Jews. There's a form of philo-Semitism there now, too. New memorials, new discussions of what went on during the war, a readiness to talk about Mussolini and some of the nasty things he did with the Jews. So I guess my question is, does the philo-Semitism have to do with a kind of sense of embarrassment, maybe, about all these revelations, the gross revelations, the others that Poles were complicit in some ways in the Holocaust? Are the same people who are philo-Semitic aware, of this kind of Polish role in the Holocaust, that they weren't just innocent, bystanders, but that they were, participating in some way? So how does that work together? Is there a kind of sense of, righting a wrong, which you get a little bit in Germany, right? And you get that a lot in Germany, so those are the two questions.
So I'll start with the second. Do you want? Yeah, I'll start with the second because you chose a word that's actually a good one, embarrassment. I would say shame, but not guilt, right? There is no sense of guilt because precisely because Poles were also victims of World War II and that the war was really fought on Polish ground. Yeah. But embarrassment, and actually stronger, the word of shame, feelings of shame, is often at the origin of people who want to study, learn Hebrew or Yiddish or something like this, and a curiosity. It's clearly in a lot of my, interviews, especially with people in their, 40s, that learning about Yad Vabne and about reading Jan Gross's book was the defining moment. This is where it really kind of, and it corresponds also with Poland's accession to the EU. So there's funds to do all of that stuff. So there's a curiosity that's about that. The acceptance that Poles did participate, being ashamed of that, and engaging. Although it's not, not everyone who goes to a festival is at that level. So that's why in the book, I developed these forms of engagement with Jewish culture, depending on the motivations of individuals. People who have this kind of empathetic, or what I call like a political register of engagement, I would say they're a minority still, right? I mean, so that goes to your question about how deep. I would not say that the majority of people who participate in this are deeply invested. So that's why it's less the festivals or the museums, it's how people approach a museum like this. So someone could go to the Polin Museum and actually have a very deep reflection about this and be critical of the museum, whereas someone else will go and find it a celebration of Polish greatness, right? So I would say that this deeper engagement is still a minority, although it is not only an intellectual, it's not just relegated to, Warsaw, Krakow intellectuals. You go to small towns and villages and you meet history teachers and like villages, and some of them are engaged in that kind of, whether it can turn, absolutely. There's no question. And it's in, I'm just coming back from Poland. I mean, I'm not seeing the turn. I'm not seeing anti-Zionist reaction so far, although the Jewish community is very worried about that it could happen, and security is reinforced in every Jewish site.
Even Gaza.
Yes.
Thank you for a really interesting topic. I have two questions. The first is about the economic dimension to these memorial practices. So I imagine that tourism plays a big role, in particular Jewish tourism, to both sites like Krakow, but also smaller towns where people are maybe coming from Israel or the United States and going to see where their family used to live.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, what how big of a role does that play in this process? And then the second question is also about kind of the engagement of non-activists or those who aren't like deeply engaged with this. I think it's interesting that like there's such a partisan dimension to the narrative around Jewishness. So on the one hand, it seems like people would take their kind of evaluations of this Jewish term to be shaped by their partisan affiliation. On the other hand, people have these family histories and their own stories that seem to kind of cross-cut partisan cleavages. So I'm wondering what the role of partisanship is in how non-activists engage with these.
Even in activists, you see, I mean, I've met, peace, law and justice supporters who actually are involved in the Jewish revival or dance in Jewish, whatever. I mean, there's some who are, conservative Catholics, although the majority tend to be on the kind of what's called open Catholicism and more intellectual, less folkloric forms of Catholicism. But it doesn't map on completely onto that. And I have one chapter where I analyze one specific project that was, actually I'm sure, because you worked with Magda, I Miss You, Jew. And so the artist started graffitis and murals all over Poland writing I Miss You, Jew. So really interesting project. And people would leave testimonies of Jews they miss, real people, and some kind of romantic visions of a Jewish past. And what I found is that so I call that romantic Philosemitism. That's very nostalgic and very problematic, actually, because they imagine, they go back to all sorts of actually often anti-Semitic prejudices. Oh, I miss the smiling Jew with, they're so smart, sprytny, I mean, they're small, conniving, smart, and all of this. They mean this as a positive, but it's steeped in anti-Semitic ideas of Jews and very romanticized ideas of what the Jewish past of Poland was about. So that would be my answer. But most people, I mean, celebrate Jewish culture are closer to the left than to the far right. Your other question about the commercial and the economic, there's no question that there's an economic impact. And I visited some smaller towns that are on the shtetl route, for example. And, one activist, so that was an interesting interview because the activist actually was responsible for renovating the Khmelnik synagogue, turn it into a museum. When I'm asked, so it's something important, really accomplished something significant. But he says, well, some villages have a castle, we have a synagogue. Right? So, I mean, there's something, let's do, so there is an economic interest. And it's about wanting to be more than a kind of a poor, uninteresting town.
One question over there, and there's a question off the screen that also will read later.
So I've researched Philosemitism in East Asia a fair amount, and that is substantially different. It's often rooted in idealizing stereotypes of Jews as opposed to embracing Jewish culture and whatnot, and that's posed a lot of issues because those stereotypes existed, and then post October 7th, there's sort of been a switch, and now they're viewed negatively, like, oh, Jews run the world, whatever, and that, so have so much power, etc. And so you touched on this a little bit earlier, but could you elaborate more on the effects of October 7th on Philosemitism in Poland?
Well, I think that there's less of that switch hasn't been made because actually Poles and even the Polish state is using its Jewish past to also rebrand itself and to reimagine and represent itself as, less backward, like, we were multicultural, we had democracy before everyone else in Europe. I mean, that's part of that So it's still important. This is one thing that they use to think of themselves and represent themselves as modern. And the Museum of Polish Jews in Warsaw was actually, the idea of it came from one of the founder of Law and Justice, right? So it's not that it's completely left right, because it serves a purpose. That's what I would. And the use of stereotypes, I mean, I think that there's more Islamophobia in Poland than actually there's anti-Semitism. It's interesting. I mean, my Jewish friends, observant friends who wear kippahs and who are visibly Jewish in the public sphere, still tell me that they feel way safer in Poland than they feel in anywhere else in Europe, especially France, for example, right? So you haven't had, the same rise of anti-Semitism acts in Poland since October 7th, like there has been in other places, and before that also.
Yeah, so question, you talked about the dangers of focusing on an other to expand the symbolic boundaries of the nation. From your perspective, how could Poles better transform Polish identity to a secular one?
Yeah, so in my conclusion, I talk about this. I mean, I think that they need to really discuss Catholicism. They need to be more critical, and then it's going to be interesting to see with the new government now. I was just reading the newspaper this morning, big debates about, again, religious instruction in schools, right? And the fact that the grade for religious instruction is included in the average, someone's GPA in school. So I think that Poles, instead of kind of going, resurrecting Jewish culture, maybe they can be more forceful in their critique of an institution that's problematic. So I mean, that's in terms of, but that's a political statement, right? I mean, that's a political problem, and I think that if they want to solve that issue, they need to be more forcefully critical of Catholicism and defend secularism.
Along those same lines, your choice of resurrection.
Yeah.
It has a lot of religious connotation,
Absolutely.
of course.
And I'm using that, actually, resurrection is very important because I wanted to underline that it is a project carried by Catholic Poles, right? I mean, and that's very important. Because all of the 40 festivals, it's not Polish Jews who are creating them and going, although Polish Jews do participate in some of the festivals. They go, there's a lot of, at the Krakow Festival, 68ers, the Jews who were kicked out of Poland in 68 often have reunions and they go like this. But my use of resurrect, it is also like a Christian project of secularization as has Christian roots.
And the Jewish denial of the resurrection of Christ was a great anti-Semitic theme back in the Middle Ages. And so it's not a positive thing to recall we're resurrecting our Jewish community. In a sense, it's the opposite.
Right. So, I mean, that is a term that is problematic, but it's to capture that, actually.
So I have two questions.
This
was super interesting. The first question kind of relates to this relationship with current politics, with law and justice being in power, because when you say that kind of reckoning with the role of Catholicism in Polish society is an alternative to kind of this phenomenon that's going on, to what extent do you think the fact that there were no kind of institutional needs for progressing with that rhetoric, secularization under peace, kind of strengthened this Philosemitism? So because liberals couldn't effectively campaign for kind of changing the role of separating church and state a little better, then they kind of opted for this other way of conceptualizing identity that's kind of separate from that state.
But I think that it predates peace.
Yeah, but I wonder if it has like kind of changed. It has like
Change-
endured or strengthened.
Change when, like since this fall?
Peace was in while peace was in power.
Actually, when you look at, you know, all sorts of Jewish activities, I mean, really when it starts, it's like 2001, 2, and this is like 2010. So even before they come to power, I mean, they were in power in the parliament before, but really the long tenure is 2015. This is when they really go and they push their historical policy. I don't see like a big rise against that at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, for sure, what I see under peace, really, it's the LGBTQ issues become really what the left is really going to be pushing and supporting. And this is also what peace is, you know, focused on, right? They have this anti-gender policy. They become like super hyper-focused on any feminist that is also, you know, feminists are accused of being Jewish, right? Magdalena Schroeder, for example, wrote about this, like that gays are the new Jews, and she herself is constantly accused of being a Jew.
My apologies.
Oh, no.
Correctly.
Thank you so much. Your talk made me think of this great, realized for the first time that both my husband and I have grandparents who were born in Poland, but neither of us think of us as Polish. I think of my family as German, and he thinks of his as Jewish. So that made me think about the fact that as you're talking about sort of this reclaiming in historical vein of sort of Poland's multicultural history, there are cultures that one cannot seize upon, and there are cultures that one can.
Right.
There's going to be sort of no revival of sort of Poland's German heritage, presumably. But I guess what are the other competing groups or stories that think about Norman's question, like could supplant sort of the philosemitism side? Who else is in sort of these stories
So it's an interesting question. I mean, so for example, the woman who told me about Swahili is not, okay. So this woman is Silesian. Silesia has a very strong local identity, and actually that's the largest national minority in Poland. Self-declared, it's got parties that are supportive of Silesia's independence from Poland, et cetera, et cetera. When I asked, so she was learning Yiddish. When I asked, oh, do you speak Silesian? She looked at me as if I was crazy. Like, why? My grandmother speaks that dialect, Vara, So there's no symbolic capital really for her as like a hip, 30-something. But Yiddish, that was like something that she would learn. So same thing, there's no focus on the Wamka or the, Kashubi or whatever. Ukrainians that's an interesting case to think about, because Ukrainians in Polish imagination traditionally are peasants, and you don't build an identity, you don't build modern identity around that. However, now they're becoming freedom fighters and fighting for democracy, and there's a large number of Ukrainians. And so Ukrainianness could be seen, how Poles think of Ukrainianness could change with the arrival of refugees, although I don't see that quite yet, but that could be possible. How people are thinking about multiculturalism is more around sexual minorities. I mean, that's where like the political left is kind of going.
On that sort of optimistic note, thank you very much for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.